Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. The Road to Mecca by Muhammad Asad. To purchase this book, kindly check the links in the description. The Story of a Story. The story I am going to tell in this book is not the autobiography of a man conspicuous for his role in public affairs. It is not a narrative of adventure, for although many strange adventures have come my way, they were never more than an accompaniment to what was happening within me. It is not even the story of a deliberate search for faith, for that faith came upon me over the years without any endeavor on my part to find it. My story is simply the story of a European's discovery of Islam and of his integration within the Muslim community. I had never thought of writing it, for it had not occurred to me that my life might be of particular interest to anyone except myself. But when, after an absence of 25 years from the West, I came to Paris and then to New York in the beginning of 1952, I was forced to alter this view. Serving as Pakistan's Minister Plenipotentiary to the United Nations, I was naturally in the public eye and encountered a great deal of curiosity among my European and American friends and acquaintances. At first, they assumed that mine was the case of a European expert, employed by an Eastern government for a specific purpose, and that I had conveniently adapted myself to the ways of the nation which I was serving. But when my activities at the United Nations made it obvious that I identified myself not merely functionally, but also emotionally and intellectually with the political and cultural aims of the Muslim world in general, they became somewhat perplexed. More and more people began to question me about my past experiences. They came to know that very early in my life I had started my career as a foreign correspondent for continental newspapers, and after several years of extensive travels throughout the Middle East, had become a Muslim in 1926. That after my conversion to Islam, I lived for nearly 6 years in Arabia and enjoyed the friendship of King Ibn Saud. That after leaving Arabia, I went to India and there met the great Muslim poet-philosopher and spiritual father of the Pakistan idea, Muhammad Iqbal. It was he who soon persuaded me to give up my plans of traveling to eastern Turkestan, China and Indonesia, and to remain in India to help elucidate the intellectual premises of the future Islamic State, which was then hardly more than a dream in Iqbal's visionary mind. To me, as to Iqbal, this dream represented a way, indeed the only way to a revival of all the dormant hopes of Islam, the creation of a political entity of people bound together not by common descent, but by their common adherence to an ideology. For years I devoted myself to this ideal, studying, writing, and lecturing, and in time gained something of a reputation as an interpreter of Islamic law and culture. When Pakistan was established in 1947, I was called upon by its government to organize and direct a Department of Islamic Reconstruction, which was to elaborate the ideological Islamic concepts of statehood and community upon which the newly born political organization might draw. After 2 years of this extremely stimulating activity, I transferred to the Pakistan Foreign Service and was appointed head of the Middle East Division in the Foreign Ministry, where I dedicated myself to strengthening the ties between Pakistan and the rest of the Muslim world. And in due course I found myself in Pakistan's mission to the United Nations at New York. All this pointed to far more than a mere outward accommodation of a European to a Muslim community, in which he happened to live. It rather indicated a conscious, wholehearted transference of allegiance from one cultural environment to another entirely different one. And this appeared very strange to most of my Western friends. They could not quite picture to themselves how a man of Western birth and upbringing could have so fully and apparently with no mental reservations whatever identified himself with the Muslim world. How it had been possible for him to exchange his Western cultural heritage for that of Islam, and what it was that had made him accept a religious and social ideology which they seemed to take for granted, and what it was that had made him accept a religious and social ideology which, they seemed to take for granted, was vastly inferior to all European concepts. Now why, I asked myself, should my Western friends take this so readily for granted? Had any of them ever really bothered to gain a direct insight into Islam? Or were their opinions based merely on the handful of cliches and distorted notions that had been handed down to them from previous generations? Could it perhaps be that the old Greco Roman mode of thought, which divided the world into Greeks and Romans on one side and barbarians on the other, was still so thoroughly ingrained in the Western mind that it was unable to concede, even theoretically, positive value to anything that lay outside its own cultural orbit? Ever since Greek and Roman times, European thinkers and historians have been prone to contemplate the history of the world from the standpoint and in terms of European history and Western cultural experiences alone. Non-Western civilizations enter the picture only insofar as their existence, or particular movements within them, have or had a direct influence on the destinies of Western man. And thus, in Western eyes, the history of the world and its various cultures amounts in the last resort to little more than an expanded history of the West. Naturally, such a narrow angle of vision is bound to produce a distorted perspective. Accustomed as he is to writings which depict the culture or discuss the problems of his own civilization in great detail and in vivid colors, with little more than side glances here and there at the rest of the world, the average European or American easily succumbs to the illusion that the cultural experiences of the West are not merely superior, but out of all proportion to those of the rest of the world, and thus that the Western way of life is the only valid norm by which other ways of life could be adjudged, implying, of course, that every intellectual concept, social institution, or ethical valuation that disagrees with the Western norm belongs ipso to a lower grade of existence. Following in the footsteps of the Greeks and Romans, the Occidental likes to think that all those other civilizations are or were only so many stumbling experiments on the path of progress so unerringly pursued by the West. Or at best, as in the case of the ancestor civilizations, which preceded that of the modern West in a direct line, no more than consecutive chapters in one and the same book, of which Western civilization is, of course, the final chapter. When I expounded this view to an American friend of mine, a man of considerable intellectual attainments and a scholarly bent of mind, he was somewhat skeptical at first. Granted, he said, the ancient Greeks and Romans were limited in their approach to foreign civilizations. But was not this the limitation the inevitable result of difficulties of communication between them and the rest of the world? And has not this difficulty been largely overcome in modern times? After all, we Westerners do concern ourselves nowadays with what is going on outside our own cultural orbit. Aren't you forgetting the many books about Oriental art and philosophy that have been published in Europe and America during the last quarter century, about the political ideas that preoccupy the minds of Eastern peoples? Surely one could not with justice overlook this desire on the part of Westerners to understand what other cultures might have to offer. To some extent you may be right, I replied. There is little doubt that the primitive Greco-Roman outlook is no longer fully operative these days. Its harshness has been considerably blunted, if for no other reason, because the more mature among Western thinkers have grown disillusioned and skeptical about many aspects of their own civilization, and now begin to look at other parts of the world for cultural inspiration. Upon some of them it is dawning that there may be not only one book and one story of human progress, but many, simply because mankind in the historical sense is not a homogeneous entity, but rather a variety of groups with widely divergent ideas as to the meaning and purpose of human life. Still, I do not feel that the West has really become less condescending toward foreign cultures than the Greeks and Romans were. It has only become more tolerant. Mind you, not toward Islam, only toward certain other Eastern cultures, which offer some sort of spiritual attraction to the spirit-hungry West and are, at the same time, too distant from the Western worldview to constitute any real challenge to its values. What do you mean by that? Well, I answered, when a Westerner discusses, say, Hinduism or Buddhism, he is always conscious of the fundamental differences between these ideologies and his own. He may admire this or that of their ideas, but would naturally never consider the possibility of substituting them for his own, because he a priori admits this impossibility. He is able to contemplate such really alien cultures with equanimity and often with sympathetic appreciation. But when it comes to Islam, which is by no means as alien to Western values as Hindu or Buddhist philosophy, this Western equanimity is almost invariably disturbed by an emotional bias. Is it perhaps, I sometimes wonder, because the values of Islam are close enough to those of the West to constitute a potential challenge to many Western concepts of spiritual and social life? And I went on to tell him of a theory which I had conceived some years ago, a theory that might perhaps help one to understand better the deep-seated prejudice against Islam, so often to be found in Western literature and contemporary thought. To find a truly convincing explanation of this prejudice, I said, one has to look far backward into history and try to comprehend the psychological background of the earliest relations between the Western and the Muslim worlds. What Occidentals think and feel about Islam today is rooted in impressions that were born during the Crusades. The Crusades? Exclaimed my friend. You don't mean to say that what happened nearly 1,000 years ago could still have an effect on people of the 20th century? But it does. I know it sounds incredible, but don't you remember the incredulity which greeted the early discoveries of the psychoanalysts when they tried to show that much of the emotional life of a mature person, and most of those seemingly unaccountable leanings, tastes, and prejudices comprised in the term idiosyncrasies, can be traced back to the experiences of his most formative age, his early childhood? Well, are nations and civilizations anything but collective individuals? Their development also is bound up with the experiences of their early childhood. As with children, those experiences may have been pleasant or unpleasant. They may have been perfectly rational, or alternatively, due to the child's naive misinterpretation of an event. The molding effect of every such experience depends primarily on its original intensity. The century immediately preceding the Crusades, that is, the end of the first millennium of the Christian era, might well be described as the early childhood of Western civilization. I proceeded to remind my friend, himself an historian, that this had been the age when, for the first time since the dark centuries that followed the breakup of Imperial Rome, Europe was beginning to see its own cultural way. Independently of the almost forgotten Roman heritage, new literatures were just then coming into existence in the European vernaculars, inspired by the religious experience of Western Christianity. Fine arts were slowly awakening from the lethargy caused by the warlike migrations of the Goths, Huns, and Avars. Out of the crude conditions of the early Middle Ages, a new cultural world was emerging. It was at that critical, extremely sensitive stage of its development that Europe received its most formidable shock, in modern parlance, a trauma, in the shape of the Crusades. The Crusades were the strongest collective impression on a civilization that had just begun to be conscious of itself. Historically speaking, they represented Europe's earliest and entirely successful attempt to view itself under the aspect of cultural unity. Nothing that Europe has experienced before or after could compare with the enthusiasm which the First Crusade brought into being. A wave of intoxication swept over the continent, an elation which for the first time overstepped the barriers between states and tribes and classes. Before then, there had been Franks and Saxons and Germans, Burgundians and Sicilians, Normans and Lombards, a medley of tribes and races with scarcely anything in common, but the fact that most of their feudal kingdoms and principalities were remnants of the Roman Empire, and that all of them professed the Christian faith. But in the Crusades, and through them, the religious bond was elevated to a new plane, a cause common to all Europeans alike, the politico-religious concept of Christendom, which in its turn gave birth to the cultural concept of Europe. When, in his famous speech at Clermont, in November 1095, Pope Urban II exhorted the Christians to make war upon the wicked race that held the Holy Land, he enunciated, probably without knowing it himself, the charter of Western civilization. The traumatic experience of the Crusades gave Europe its cultural awareness and its unity, but the same experience was destined henceforth also to provide the false color in which Islam was to appear to Western eyes, not simply because the Crusades meant war and bloodshed. So many wars have been waged between nations and subsequently forgotten, and so many animosities which in their time seemed ineradicable have later turned into friendships. The damage caused by the Crusades was not restricted to a clash of weapons. It was first and foremost an intellectual damage, the poisoning of the Western mind against the Muslim world through a deliberate misrepresentation of the teachings and ideals of Islam. For, if the call for a crusade was to maintain its validity, the Prophet of the Muslims had of necessity to be stamped as the Antichrist, and his religion depicted in the most lurid terms as a fount of immorality and perversion. It was at the time of the Crusades that the ludicrous notion that Islam was a religion of crude sensualism and brutal violence, of an observance of ritual instead of a purification of the heart, entered the Western mind and remained there. And it was then that the name of the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the same Muhammad who had insisted that his own followers respect the prophets of other religions, was contemptuously transformed by Europeans into Mahound. The age when the spirit of independent inquiry could raise its head was as yet far distant in Europe. It was easy for the powers that were to sow the dark seeds of hatred for a religion and civilization that was so different from the religion and civilization of the West. Thus, it was no accident that the fiery Chanson du Roland, which describes the legendary victory of Christendom over the Muslim heathen in southern France, was composed not at the time of those battles, but 3 centuries later, to wit, shortly before the First Crusade, immediately to become a kind of national anthem of Europe. And it is no accident either that this warlike epic marks the beginning of a European literature, as distinct from the earlier, localized literatures, for hostility towards Islam stood over the cradle of European civilization. It would seem an irony of history that the age-old Western resentment against Islam, which was religious in origin, should still persist subconsciously at a time when religion has lost most of its hold on the imagination of Western man. This, however, is not really surprising. We know that a person may completely lose the religious beliefs imparted to him in his childhood while, nevertheless, some particular emotion connected with those beliefs remains, irrationally, enforced throughout his later life. And this, I concluded, is precisely what happened to that collective personality, Western civilization. The shadow of the Crusades hovers over the West to this day, and all its reactions toward Islam and the Muslim world bear distinct traces of that die-hard ghost. My friend remained silent for a long time. I can still see his tall, lanky figure pacing up and down the room, his hands in his coat pockets, shaking his head as if puzzled, and finally saying, "There may be something in what you say. Indeed, there may be, although I am not in a position to judge your theory offhand. But in any case, in the light of what you yourself have just told me, don't you realize that your life, which to you seems so very simple and uncomplicated, must appear very strange and unusual to Westerners? Could you not perhaps share some of your own experiences with them? Why don't you write your autobiography? I am sure it would make fascinating reading." Laughingly, I replied, "Well, I might perhaps let myself be persuaded to leave the Foreign Service and write such a book. After all, writing is my original profession." In the following weeks and months, my joking response imperceptibly lost the aspect of a joke. I began to think seriously about setting down the story of my life and thus helping, in however small a measure, to lift the heavy veil which separates Islam and its culture from the Occidental mind. My way to Islam had been in many respects unique. I had not become a Muslim because I had lived for a long time among Muslims. On the contrary, I decided to live among them because I had embraced Islam. Might I not, by communicating my very personal experiences to Western readers, contribute more to a mutual understanding between the Islamic and Western worlds than I could by continuing in a diplomatic position, which might be filled equally well by other countrymen of mine? After all, any intelligent man could be Pakistan's minister to the United Nations. But how many men were able to talk to Westerners about Islam as I could? I was a Muslim, but I was also of Western origin, and thus I could speak the intellectual languages of both Islam and the West. And so, toward the end of 1952, I resigned from the Pakistan Foreign Service and started to write this book. Whether it is as fascinating reading as my American friend anticipated, I cannot say. I could do no more than try to retrace from memory, with the help of only a few old notes, disjointed diary entries, and some of the newspaper articles I had written at the time, the tangled lines of a development that stretched over many years and over vast expanses of geographical space. And here it is, not the story of all my life, but only of the years before I left Arabia for India. Those exciting years spent in travels through almost all the countries between the Libyan desert and the snow-covered peaks of the Pamirs, between the Bosporus and the Arabian Sea. It is told in the context and, it should be kept in mind, on the time level of my last desert journey, from the interior of Arabia to Mecca in the late summer of 1932, for it was during those 23 days that the pattern of my life became fully apparent to myself. The Arabia, depicted in the following pages, no longer exists. Its solitude and integrity have crumbled under a strong gush of oil and the gold that the oil has brought. Its great simplicity has vanished, and with it, much that was humanly unique. It is with the pain one feels for something precious, now irretrievably lost, that I remember that last long desert track when we rode, two men on two dromedaries, through swimming light. Start of Chapter 1. Thirst. Section 1. We ride, two men on two dromedaries. The sun flames over our heads. Everything is shimmer and glimmer and swimming light. Reddish and orange-colored dunes, dunes behind dunes beyond dunes, loneliness and burning silence, and two men on two dromedaries in that swinging gait which makes you sleepy, so that you forget the day, the sun, the hot wind and the long way. Tufts of yellow grass grow sparsely on the crests of the dunes, and here and there gnarled, humped bushes wind over the sand like giant snakes. Sleepy have become the senses. You are rocking in the saddle. You perceive hardly anything beyond the crunching of the sand under the camel's soles, and the rub of the saddle peg against the crook of your knee. Your face is wrapped in your headcloth for protection against sun and wind, and you feel as if you were carrying your own loneliness, like a tangible substance, across it, right across it, to the wells of Taima, to the dark wells of Taima that give water to him that is thirsty. Right across the Nufud to Taima, I hear a voice, and do not know whether it is a dream or the voice of my companion. Didst thou say something, Zed? I was saying, replies my companion, that not many people would venture right across the Nufud just to see the wells of Taima. Zed and I are returning from Kasarat Taimin on the Najd Iraqi frontier where I went at the request of King Ibn Saud. Having accomplished my mission and with plenty of leisure time at my disposal, I decided to visit the remote, ancient oasis of Taima, nearly 200 miles to the southwest. The Taima of the Old Testament of which Isaiah said, "The inhabitants of the land of Taima brought water to him that was thirsty." The abundance of Taima's water, its huge wells which have no like in all Arabia, made it in pre-Islamic days a great center of caravan trade and a seat of early Arabian culture. I have long wanted to see it, and so, disregarding the circuitous caravan routes, we struck from Kasara Taimin right into the heart of the great Nufud, the reddish sand desert that stretches itself so mightily between the highlands of central Arabia and the Syrian desert. There is no track and no path in this part of the tremendous wasteland. The wind sees to it that no footstep of man or animal leaves a lasting trace in the soft, yielding sand, and that no landmarks stand out for long to guide the wayfarer's eye. Under the strokes of the wind the dunes incessantly change their outlines, flowing in a slow, imperceptible movement from form to form, hills ebbing into valleys and valleys growing into new hills, dotted with dry, lifeless grass that faintly rustles in the wind and is bitter as ashes even to a camel's mouth. Although I have crossed this desert many times in many directions, I would not trust myself to find my way through it unaided, and therefore I am glad to have Zed with me. This country here is his homeland. He belongs to the tribe of Shamar, who live on the southern and eastern fringes of the great Nufud and, when the heavy winter rains suddenly transform the sand dunes into lush meadows, graze their camels in its midst for a few months of the year. The moods of the desert are in Zed's blood, and his heart beats with them. Zed is probably the handsomest man I have ever known. Broad of forehead and slim of body, middle-sized, fine-boned, full of wiry strength. Over the narrow wheat-colored face with its strongly molded cheekbones and the severe and at the same time sensual mouth lies that expectant gravity which is so characteristic of the desert Arab, dignity and self-composure wedded to intimate sweetness. He is a felicitous combination of purest Bedouin stock and nutty town life, having preserved within himself the Bedouin's sureness of instinct without the Bedouin's emotional liability, and acquired the practical wisdom of the townsman without falling prey to his worldly sophistication. He, like myself, enjoys adventure without running after it. Since his earliest youth, his life has been filled with incident and excitement. As a boyish trooper in the irregular Camel Corps, levied by the Turkish government for its campaign in the Sinai Peninsula during the Great War, defender of his Shamar homeland against Ibn Saud, armed smuggler in the Persian Gulf, tempestuous lover of many women in many parts of the Arab world, all of them, of course, legitimately married to him at one time or another, and then as legitimately divorced. Horse trader in Egypt, soldier of fortune in Iraq, and lastly, for nearly 5 years, my companion in Arabia. And now, in this late summer of 1932, we ride together as so often in the past, winding our lonesome way between dunes, stopping at one or another of the widely spaced wells, and resting at night under the stars. The eternal swish swish of the animals' feet over the hot sand, sometimes during the march, Zed's husky voice chanting in rhythm with the camel's tread, night camps, cooking coffee and rice and occasional wild game. The cool sweep of the wind over our bodies as we lie at night on the sand, sunrise over sand dunes, red and violently bursting like fireworks, and sometimes, like today, the miracle of life awaking in a plant that has been watered by chance. We had stopped for our noon prayer. As I washed my hands, face, and feet from a water skin, a few drops spilled over a dried up tuft of grass at my feet, a miserable little plant, yellow and withered and lifeless under the harsh rays of the sun. But as the water trickled over it, a shiver went through the shriveled blades, and I saw how they slowly, tremblingly, unfolded. A few more drops, and the little blades moved and curled, and then straightened themselves slowly, hesitantly, tremblingly. I held my breath as I poured more water over the grass tuft. It moved more quickly, more violently, as if some hidden force were pushing it out of its dream of death. Its blades, what a delight to behold, contracted and expanded like the arms of a starfish, seemingly overwhelmed by a shy but irrepressible delirium, a real little orgy of sensual joy. And thus life re-entered victoriously what a moment ago had been as dead, entered it visibly, passionately, overpowering and beyond understanding in its majesty. Life in its majesty, you always feel it in the desert, because it is so difficult to keep and so hard. It is always like a gift, a treasure, and a surprise. For the desert is always surprising, even though you may have known it for years. Sometimes, when you think you can see it in all its rigidity and emptiness, it awakens from its dream, sends forth its breath, and tender, pale green grass stands suddenly where only yesterday there was nothing but sand and splintery pebbles. It sends forth its breath again, and a flock of small birds flutter through the air. From where? Where to? Slim bodied, long winged, emerald green, or a swarm of locusts rises up above the earth with a rush and a zoom, grey and grim and endless like a horde of hungry warriors. Life in its majesty, majesty of sparseness, always surprising. Herein lies the whole nameless scent of Arabia, of sand deserts like this one, and of the many other changing landscapes. Sometimes it is lava ground, black and jagged, sometimes dunes without end, sometimes a wadi between rocky hills, covered with thorn bushes out of which a startled hare jumps across your way. Sometimes loose sand with tracks of gazelles and a few fire-blackened stones over which long-forgotten wayfarers cooked their food in long-forgotten days. Sometimes a village beneath palm trees, and the wooden wheels over the wells make music and sing to you without stopping. Sometimes a well in the midst of a desert valley, with Bedouin herdsmen bustling around it to water their thirsty sheep and camels. They chant in chorus while the water is drawn up in large leather buckets and poured with a rush into leather troughs to the delight of the excited animals. Then again, there is loneliness in steeps overcome by a sun without mercy. Patches of hard, yellow grass and leafy bushes that crawl over the ground with snaky branches offer welcome pasture to your dromedaries. A solitary acacia tree spreads its branches wide against the steel blue sky. From between earth mounds and stones appears eyes starting right and left, and then vanishes like a ghost, the gold-skinned lizard which, they say, never drinks water. In a hollow stand black tents of goat hair. A herd of camels is being driven homeward through the afternoon. The herdsmen ride on the bare-backed young camels, and when they call their animals, the silence of the land sucks in their voices and swallows them without echo. Sometimes you see glimmering shadows far on the horizon. Are they clouds? They float low, frequently changing their color and position, now resembling gray-brown mountains, but in the air, somewhat above the horizon, and now for all the world to see, shady groves of stone pines, but in the air. But when they come down lower and change into lakes and flowing rivers, which quiveringly reflect the mountains and the trees in their inviting waters, you suddenly recognize them for what they are. Blandishment of the jinns, the mirage that has so often led travelers to false hopes and so to perdition, and your hand goes involuntarily toward the waterskin at your saddle. And there are nights full of other dangers, when the tribes are in warlike commotion and the traveler does not light fire while camping so as not to be seen from the distance, and sits wide awake through long hours, his rifle between the knees, and those days of peace when after a long lonely wandering you meet a caravan and listen in the evening to the talk of the grave, sunburned men around the campfire. They talk of the simple great things of life and death, of hunger and satiety, of pride and love and hatred, of the lust of the flesh and its appeasement, of wars, of the palm groves in the distant home village, and you never hear idle babbling, for one cannot babble in the desert. And you feel the call of life in the days of thirst, when the tongue sticks to the palate like a piece of dry wood, and the horizon sends no deliverance but offers flaming summer wind and whirling sand instead. And in yet different days, when you are a guest in Bedouin tents and the men bring you bowls full of milk, the milk of fat she-camels at the beginning of spring, when after strong rain falls the steeps and dunes are green as a garden, and the animals' udders heavy and round. From a corner of the tent you can hear the women laugh, while they cook a sheep in your honor over an open fire. Like red metal, the sun disappears behind hills. Higher than anywhere else in the world is the starry sky at night. Deep and dreamless your sleep under the stars. Pale grey and cool dawn the mornings. Cold are the nights in winter. Biting winds flap against the campfire around you, and your companions huddle together in search of warmth. Burning the days in summer when you ride on your rocking dromedary through endless hours, your face muffled in your headcloth to protect it from the searing wind, your senses lulled into sleepiness, while high above you in the noon heat a bird of prey draws its circles. Section 2. The afternoon glides slowly past us with its tunes, and its silence, and its loneliness. After a while, the loneliness is broken by a group of Bedouins who cross our path. 4 or 5 men and 2 women, mounted on dromedaries, with a beast of burden carrying a folded black tent, cooking pots, and other utensils of nomad life, with a couple of children perched on top of it all. As they come upon us, they rein in their animals. Peace be with you, and we answer, and with you be peace and the grace of God. What is your destination, O wayfarers? Taima, inshallah. And whence come you? From Kasarat Taimin, brothers, I reply. And then there is silence. One of them, a gaunt, elderly man with sharp face and a black, pointed beard, is obviously the leader. His glance also is black and pointed when, passing over Zad, it rests suspiciously on me, the stranger of light complexion, who has so unexpectedly appeared from nowhere in this pathless wilderness. A stranger who says he is coming from the direction of British-held Iraq, and might well be, I can almost read Sharp-Face's thought, an infidel surreptitiously entering the land of the Arabs. The old man's hand plays, as if in perplexity, with the pommel of his saddle while his people, now loosely grouped around us, obviously waiting for him to speak. After a few moments, he seems to be unable to bear the silence any longer, and he asks me, "Of which Arabs art thou?" meaning to what tribe or region I belong. But even before I am able to reply, his features light up in a sudden smile of recognition. "Oh, I know thee now. I have seen thee with Abdulaziz, but that was long ago, 4 long years ago." And he stretches his hand in friendliness towards me, and recalls the time when I was living in the royal castle at Riyadh, and he came there in the retinue of a Shamar chieftain to pay the respects of the tribe to Ibn Saud, whom the Bedouins always call by his first name, Abdelaziz, without any formal, honorific title, for in their free humanity they see only a man in the king, to be honored, no doubt, but not beyond the deserts of man. And so we go on for a while reminiscing, speaking of this man and that, exchanging anecdotes about Riyadh, in and around which up to 1,000 guests live daily off the king's bounty. And so we go on for a while reminiscing, speaking of this man and that, exchanging anecdotes about Riyadh, in and around which up to 1,000 guests live daily off the king's bounty, receiving on departure presents that vary in accordance with each man's status, from a handful of silver coins or an abaya, to the heavy purses of golden sovereigns, horses or dromedaries which he frequently distributes among the chieftains. But the king's generosity is not so much a matter of the purse as of the heart. Perhaps more than anything, it is his warmth of feeling that makes the people around him, not excepting myself, love him. In all my years in Arabia, Ibn Saud's friendship has lain like a warm shimmer over my life. He calls me his friend, although he is a king and I am a mere journalist. And I call him my friend, not merely because throughout the years that I have lived in his realm, he has shown me much friendliness, for that he shows to many men. I call him my friend because on occasion he opens his innermost thoughts to me as he opens his purse to so many others. I love to call him my friend, for despite all his faults, and there are not a few of them, he is an exceedingly good man, not just kind-hearted, for kindness of heart can sometimes be a cheap thing, as you would admiringly say of an old Damascene blade, that it is a good weapon because it has all the qualities you could demand from a weapon of its kind. Thus do I consider Ibn Saud a good man. He is rounded within himself and always follows his own path, and if he often errs in his actions, it is because he never tries to be anything but himself. My first meeting with King Abdulaziz ibn Saud took place at Mecca early in 1927, a few months after my conversion to Islam. The recent sudden death of my wife, who had accompanied me on this my first pilgrimage to Mecca, had made me bitter and unsocial. I was desperately striving to clamber out of darkness and utter desolation. Most of my time was spent in my lodgings. I had contact with only a few people, and for weeks I avoided even the customary courtesy call on the king. Then one day, while visiting one of Ibn Saud's foreign guests, it was, I remember, Haji Agus Salim of Indonesia, I was informed that by order of the king my name had been entered on his guest list. He seemed to have been apprised of the reason of my reserve and to accept it with silent understanding. And so, a guest who had never yet seen the face of his host. I moved into a beautiful house at the southern end of Mecca, near the rocky gorge through which the way to Yemen passes. From the terrace, I could see a large part of the city, the minarets of the great mosque, thousands of white cubes of houses, with roof balustrades of colored bricks, and the dead desert hills domed by skies that glared like liquid metal. Still, I might have gone on postponing my call on the king, had it not been for a chance encounter with Amir Faisal, his second son, in a library under the arcades of the great mosque. It was pleasant to sit in that long, narrow room surrounded by old Arabic, Persian, and Turkish folios. Its stillness and darkness filled me with peace. One day, however, the usual silence was broken by the swishing entry of a group of men, preceded by armed bodyguards. It was Amir Faisal with his retinue passing through the library on his way to the Kaaba. He was tall and thin and of a dignity far beyond his 22 years and his beardless face. In spite of his youth, he had been given the important position of viceroy of the Hijaz after his father's conquest of the country 2 years earlier. His elder brother, Crown Prince Saud, was viceroy of Najd, while the king himself spent half the year in Mecca, the capital of the Hijaz, and the other half in the Najdi capital, Riyadh. The librarian, a young Meccan scholar with whom I had been friendly for some time, introduced me to the prince. He shook hands with me, and when I bowed to him, he lightly tipped my head back with his fingers and his face lit up in a warm smile. We people of Najd do not believe that man should bow before man. He should bow only before God in prayer. He seemed to be kind, dreamy, and a little reserved and shy, an impression which was confirmed during the later years of our acquaintance. His air of nobility was not assumed. It seemed to glow from within. When we spoke to each other on that day in the library, I suddenly felt a strong desire to meet the father of this son. The king would be happy to see thee, said Amir Faisal. Why dost thou shun him? And the next morning the Emir's secretary fetched me in an automobile and took me to the king's palace. We passed through the bazaar street of Al Mala, slowly making our way through a noisy throng of camels, Bedouins and auctioneers selling all kinds of Bedouin wares, camel saddles, abayas, carpets, water skins, silver inlaid swords, tents and brass coffee pots. Then through a wider, quieter and more open road, and finally reached the huge house in which the king resided. Many saddled camels filled the open space before it, and a number of armed slaves and retainers lounged about the entrance stairway. I was made to wait in a spacious, pillared room whose floor was laid with inexpensive carpets. Broad, khaki-covered divans ran along the walls, and green leaves could be seen through the windows, the beginnings of a garden which was being grown with great difficulty out of the arid soil of Mecca. A black slave appeared. "The king invites thee." I entered a room like the one I had just left, except that it was rather smaller and lighter, one side opening fully onto the garden. Rich Persian carpets covered the floor. In a bay window overlooking the garden the king sat cross-legged on a divan. At his feet on the floor a secretary was taking dictation. When I entered, the king rose, extended both hands, and said, "Ahlan wa sahlan, family and plain," which means, "You have now arrived within your family, and may your foot tread on an easy plain." The most ancient and most gracious of Arabian expressions of welcome. For just a second I was able to gaze in wonderment at Ibn Saud's gigantic height. When by then aware of the Najdi custom, I lightly kissed the tip of his nose and his forehead. I had to stand on my toes despite my 6 feet, while he had to bend his head downward. Then, with an apologetic gesture in the direction of the secretary, he sat down, pulling me to his side on the divan. "Just a minute, the letter is nearly finished." While he quietly continued to dictate, he also opened a conversation with me, never confusing the two themes. After a few formal sentences, I handed him a letter of introduction. He read it, which meant doing 3 things at once, and then, without interrupting his dictation or his inquiry after my welfare, called for coffee. By that time I had an opportunity to observe him more closely. He was so well proportioned that his huge size, he must have been at least 6.5 feet, became apparent only when he stood. His face, framed in the traditional red and white checked kufiya, and topped by a gold-threaded igal, was strikingly virile. He wore his beard and moustache clipped short in Najdi fashion. His forehead was broad, his nose strong and aquiline, and his full mouth appeared at times almost feminine, but without being soft in its sensual tenderness. While he spoke, his features were enlivened by unusual mobility, but in repose his face was somehow sad, as if withdrawn in inner loneliness. The deep setting of his eyes may have had something to do with this. The superb beauty of his face was slightly marred by the vague expression of his left eye, in which a white film was discernible. In later times I learned the story of this affliction, which most people unknowingly attributed to natural causes. In reality, however, it had occurred under tragic circumstances. Some years earlier, one of his wives, at the instigation of the rival dynasty of Ibn Rashid, had put poison into his incense vessel, a little brazier used at ceremonial gatherings in Najd, with the obvious intention of killing him. As usual, the brazier was handed first to the king before being passed around among his guests. On inhaling the first whiff, Ibn Saud immediately sensed that there was something wrong with the incense and dashed the vessel to the ground. His alertness saved his life, but not before his left eye had been affected and partially blinded. But instead of avenging himself on the faithless woman, as many another potentate in his position would surely have done, he forgave her, for he was convinced that she had been the victim of insuperable influences at the hands of her family, who were related to the house of Ibn Rashid. He merely divorced her and sent her back, richly endowed with gold and gifts, to her home at Hail. After that first meeting, the king sent for me almost daily. One morning I went to him with the intention of asking, without much hope of its being granted, permission to travel into the interior of the country, for Ibn Saud did not, as a rule, allow foreigners to visit Najd. Nevertheless, I was about to bring this matter up, when suddenly the king shot a brief, sharp glance in my direction, a glance which seemed to penetrate to my unspoken thoughts, smiled, and said, "Wilt thou not, O Muhammad, come with us to Najd and stay for a few months at Riyadh?" I was dumbfounded, and so obviously were the other people present. Such a spontaneous invitation to a stranger was almost unheard of. He went on, "I would like thee to travel by motor car with me next month." I took a deep breath and answered, "May God lengthen thy life, O Imam. But what use would that be to me? What good would it do me to whiz in 5 or 6 days from Mecca to Riyadh, without having seen anything of thy country beyond the desert? Some sand dunes and perhaps, somewhere on the horizon, people like shadows. If thou hast no objection, a dromedary would suit me better, a longer wait than all thy car together." Ibn Saud laughed. "Art thou thus tempted to look into the eyes of my Bedouins? I must warn thee beforehand, they are backward people, and my Najd is a desert land without charms, and the camel saddle will be hard and the food dreary on the journey. Nothing but rice and dates and occasionally meat. But so be it. If thou hast set thy heart on it, thou shalt ride. And, after all, it may well be that thou wilt not regret having come to know my people. They are poor, they know nothing and are nothing, but their hearts are full of good faith." And some weeks later, equipped by the king with dromedaries, provisions, a tent, and a guide, I set out by a roundabout route to Riyadh, which I reached over 2 months. That was my first journey into the interior of Arabia, the first of many, for the few months of which the king had spoken grew into years. How easily they grew into years! Spent not only in Riyadh but in almost every part of Arabia, and the saddle is hard no longer. May God lengthen the life of Abdulaziz, says Sharpface. He loves the Badu and the Badu love him. And why should they not? I ask myself. The king's open-handedness toward the Bedouins of Najd has become a standing feature of his administration. Not a very admirable feature, perhaps, for the regular gifts of money which Ibn Saud distributes among the tribal chieftains, and their followers have made them so dependent on his largesse that they are beginning to lose all incentive to improve their living conditions by their own endeavors, and are gradually lapsing into the status of dole receivers, content to remain ignorant and indolent. Throughout my conversation with Sharpface, Zad seems impatient. While he talks one of the men, his eyes frequently rest on me, as if to remind me that there is a long way before us, and that reminiscences and reflections do not quicken the camel's pace. We part. The Shamar Bedouins ride away to stand. We can hear one of them intone a nomad chant, such as a camel rider sings to spur his beast, and to break the monotony of his ride. and as Zed and I resume our westward course toward far-off Daima, the melody gradually fades away, and silence returns. Section 3. Look there! Zad's voice breaks through the silence. A hare! I turn my eyes to the bundle of grey fur that has leaped out of a clump of bushes, while Zad slides down from his saddle, unslinging the wooden mace that hangs on the pommel. He bounds after the hare and swings the mace over his head for the throw, but just as he is about to hurl it, he catches his foot in a humped root, falls flat on his face, and the hare disappears from sight. There goes a good supper. I laugh as he picks himself up, ruefully eyeing the mace in his hand. But mind it not, Zad. That hare was obviously not our portion. No, it was not, he replies, somewhat absent-mindedly, and then I see that he is limping painfully. Didst thou hurt thyself, Zad? Oh, it's nothing. I only twisted my ankle. It will get better in a little while. But it does not get better. After another hour in the saddle, I can see beads of perspiration on Zad's face, and when I take a look at his foot, I find that the ankle has been badly sprained and is angrily swollen. There is no use going on like this, Zad. Let us make camp here. A night's rest will restore thee. All through the night Zad seems to be restless with pain. He awakens long before dawn, and his sudden movement stirs me also from my uneasy sleep. I see only one camel, he says, and when we look around, we discover that one of the beasts, Zad's, has indeed disappeared. Zad wants to set out on mine to search for it, but his injured foot makes it difficult for him even to stand, not to speak of walking and mounting and dismounting. Thou rest, Zad, and I shall go instead. It won't be difficult to find my way back by retracing my own tracks. And in the breaking dawn I ride away, following the tracks of the lost dromedary which wind across the sand valley and disappear behind the dunes. I ride for 1 hour, and another, and a third, but the tracks of the strayed animal go on and on, as if it had pursued a deliberate course. The forenoon is well advanced when I stop for a short halt, dismount, eat a few dates and drink from the small water skin attached to my saddle. The sun stands high, but somehow it has lost its glare. Dun-colored clouds, unusual at this time of year, float motionless under the sky. A strangely thick, heavy air envelops the desert and softens the outlines of the dunes beyond their usual softness. An eerie stare over the summit of the high sand hill in front of me catches my eye. Is it an animal? The lost camel, perhaps? But when I look more carefully, I see that the movement is not above but in the dune crest itself. The crest is moving, ever so slightly rippling forward, and then it seems to trickle down the slope toward me like the crest of a slowly breaking wave. A murky redness creeps up the sky from behind the dune. Under this redness its contours lose their sharpness and become blurred, as if a veil had suddenly been drawn across, and a reddish twilight begins to spread rapidly over the desert. A cloud of sand whirls against my face and around me, and all at once the wind begins to roar from all directions, crisscrossing the valley with powerful blasts. The trickling movement of the first hilltop has been taken up by all the sand hills within sight. In a matter of minutes, the sky darkens to a deep, rust-brown hue and the air is filled with swirling sand dust which, like a reddish fog, obscures the sun and the day. This is a sandstorm, and no mistake. My crouching dromedary, terrified, wants to rise. I pull it down by the halter, struggling to keep myself upright in the wind that has now assumed the force of a gale and managed to hobble the animal's forelegs and, to make it more secure, a hind leg as well. Then I throw myself down on the ground and draw my abaya over my head. I press my face against the camel's armpit so as not to be choked by the flying sand. I feel the animal press its muzzle against my shoulder, no doubt for the same reason. I can feel the sand being heaped upon me from the side, where I am unprotected by the dromedary's body, and have to shift from time to time to avoid being buried. I am not unduly worried, for it is not the first time that I have been surprised by a sandstorm in the desert. Lying thus on the ground, tightly wrapped in my abaya, I can do nothing but wait for the storm to abate and listen to the roar of the wind, and the flapping of my cloak, flapping like a loose sail. No, like a banner in the wind, like the flapping of a tribal banners carried on high poles by a Bedouin army on the march, just as they flapped and fluttered nearly 5 years ago over the host of Najdi Bedouin riders, thousands of them, and I among them, returning from Arafat to Mecca after the pilgrimage. It was my second pilgrimage. I had spent 1 year in the interior of the peninsula, and had managed to return to Mecca just in time to take part in the congregation of the pilgrims on the plain of Arafat, to the east of the holy city. And on the way back from Arafat, I found myself in the midst of a multitude of white-garbed Najdi Bedouins, riding in a tense gallop over the dusty plain. A sea of white-garbed men on honey-yellow, golden-brown, and red-brown dromedaries, a roaring, earth-shaking gallop of thousands of dromedaries pushing forward like an irresistible wave, the tribal banners soaring in the wind, and the tribal cries with which the men announced their various tribes, and the warlike deeds of their ancestors surging in waves over each detachment. For to the men of Najd, men of the Central Arabian highlands, war and pilgrimage spring from the same source, and the numberless pilgrims from other lands, from Egypt and India and North Africa and Java, unaccustomed to such wild abandon, scattered in panic before our approach. For nobody could have survived who stood in the way of the thundering host, just as instantaneous death would have been the portion of a rider who fell from the saddle in the midst of the thousands and thousands of galloping mounts. However mad that ride, I shared the madness and abandoned myself to the hour, and the whir and the rush and the roar with the wild happiness in my heart. And the wind that rushed past my face sang out, "Never again wilt thou be a stranger, never again among thy people." And as I lie in the sand under my flapping abaya, the roar of the sandstorm seems to echo, "Never again wilt thou be a stranger. Never again wilt thou be a stranger." I am no longer a stranger. Arabia has become my home. My western past is like a distant dream, not unreal enough to be forgotten, and not real enough to be part of my present. Not that I have become a lotus eater. On the contrary, whenever I happen to stay for some months in a town, as for instance in Medina, where I have an Arab wife and an infant son, and a library full of books on early Islamic history, I grow uneasy and begin to yearn for action and movement, for the dry, brisk air of the desert, for the smell of dromedaries and the feel of the camel saddle. Oddly enough, the urge to wander that has made me so restless for the greater part of my life. I am a little over 32 now, and lures me again and again into all manner of hazards and encounters, does not stem so much from a thirst for adventure as from a longing to find my own restful place in the world, to arrive at a point where I could correlate all that might happen to me with all that I might think, and feel and desire. And if I understand it rightly, It is this longing for inner discovery that has driven me over the years into a world entirely different, both in its perceptions and its outer forms, from all to which my European birth and upbringing had seemed to destine me. When the storm finally subsided, I shake myself free of the sand that has been heaped around me. My dromedary is half buried in it, but none the worse for an experience that must have befallen it many times. The storm itself, it would seem at first glance, has not done us any damage apart from filling my mouth, ears, and nostrils with sand and blowing away the sheepskin from my saddle. But soon I discover my error. All the dunes around me have changed their outlines. My own tracks and those of the missing camel have been blown away. I am standing on virgin ground. Now nothing remains but to go back to the camp, or at least to try to go back, with the help of the sun and the general sense of direction which is almost an instinct with someone accustomed to traveling in deserts. But here these two aids are not entirely reliable, for sand dunes do not allow you to go in a straight line, and so to keep the direction you have chosen. The storm has made me thirsty, but not expecting to be away from camp for more than a few hours. I have long ago drunk the last sip from my small water skin. However, it cannot be far to the camp, and although my dromedary has had no water since our last stop at a well some 2 days ago, it is an old campaigner and can be relied upon to carry me back. I set its nose towards where I think the camp must lie, and we start at a brisk pace. An hour passes, a second, and a third, but there is no trace of Zed or of our camping ground. None of the orange-colored hills presents a familiar appearance. It would be difficult indeed to discover anything familiar in them, even if there had been no storm. Late in the afternoon, I come upon an outcrop of granite rocks, so rare in the midst of these sand wastes, and recognize them immediately. We passed them, Zed and I, yesterday afternoon, not long before we made camp for the night. I am greatly relieved, for though it is obvious that I am way beyond the place where I hoped to find Zed, having probably missed him by a couple of miles or so. It seems to me that it should not now be difficult to find him by simply going in a southwesterly direction, as we did yesterday. There were, I remember, about 3 hours between the rocks and our night camp, but when I now ride for 3 more hours, there is no sign of the camp or of Zed. Have I missed him again? I push forward, always towards southwest, taking the movement of the sun carefully into account. 2 more hours pass, but still there is no camp and no Zed. When night falls, I decide it is senseless to continue further. Better rest and wait for the morning light. I dismount, hobble the dromedary, try to eat some dates but am too thirsty, and so I give them to the camel and lie down with my head against its body. It is a fitful doze into which I fall, not quite sleep and not quite waking, but a succession of dream states brought about by fatigue, broken by a thirst that has gradually become distressing. And, somewhere in those depths which one does not want to uncover to oneself, there is that grey squirming mollusk of fear. What will happen to me if I do not find my way back to Zed and to our water skins? For as far as I know, there is no water and no settlement for many days' journey in all directions. At dawn I start again. During the night, I calculated that I must have gone too far to the south and that, therefore, Zad's camp ought to be somewhere north-northeast of the place where I spent the night. And so toward north-northeast we go, thirsty and tired and hungry, always threading our way in wavy lines from valley to valley, circumventing sand hills now to the right, now to the left. At noon we rest. My tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth and feels like old, cracked leather. The throat is sore and the eyes inflamed. Pressed to the camel's belly, with my abaya drawn over my head, I try to sleep for a while, but cannot. The afternoon sees us again on the march, this time in a more easterly direction, for by now I know that we have gone too far west. But still there is no Zad and no camp. Another night comes. Thirst has grown to be torment, and the desire for water the one, the overpowering thought in a mind that can no longer hold orderly thoughts. But as soon as dawn lightens the sky, I ride on, through the morning, through the noonday, into the afternoon of another day. Sand dunes and heat, dunes behind dunes, and no end. Or is this perhaps the end of all my roads, of all my seeking and finding, of my coming to the people among whom I would never again be a stranger? O God, I pray, let me not perish thus. In the afternoon I climb a tall dune in the hope of getting a better view of the landscape, when I suddenly discern a dark point far to the east. I could cry with joy, only I am too weak for that, for this must be Zad's encampment, and the water-skins, the two big water-skins full of water. My knees shake as I remount my dromedary. Slowly, cautiously, we move in the direction of that black point, which can surely be nothing but Zad's camp. This time I take every precaution not to miss it. I ride in a straight line, up sand hills, down sand valleys, thus doubling, trebling our toil, but spurred by the hope that within a short while, within 2 hours at the most, I shall reach my goal. And finally, after we have crossed the last dune crest, the goal comes clearly within my sight, and I rein in the camel, and look down upon the dark something less than half a mile away, and my heart seems to stop beating. For what I see before me is the dark outcrop of granite rocks, which I passed 3 days ago with Zad, and revisited 2 days ago alone. For 2 days I have going in a circle. Section 4. When I slide down from the saddle, I am entirely exhausted. I do not even bother to hobble the camel's legs, and indeed the beast is too tired to think of running away. I weep, but no tears come from my dry, swollen eyes. How long it is since I have wept! But then is not everything long past? Everything is past, and there is no present. There is only thirst, and heat, and torment. I have been without water for nearly 3 days now, and it is 5 days since my dromedary has had its last drink. It could probably carry on like this for 1 day more, perhaps 2, but I cannot, I know it, last that long. Perhaps I shall go mad before I die, for the pain in my body is ensnared with the dread in my mind, and the one makes the other grow, searing and whispering and tearing. I want to rest, but at the same time I know that if I rest now, I shall never be able to get up again. I drag myself into the saddle and force the dromedary with beating and kicking to get up, and almost fall from the saddle when the animal lurches forward while rising on its hind legs, and again when it lurches backward, straightening its forelegs. We begin to move slowly, painfully due west. Due west! What a mockery! What does due west amount to in this deceptive, undulating sea of sand hills? But I want to live, and so we go on. We plod with the rest of our strength through the night. It must be morning when I fall from the saddle. I do not fall hard. The sand is soft and embracing. The camel stands still for a while, then slides down with a sigh on its knees, then on its hind legs, and lies crouched by my side with its neck stretched on the sand. I lie on the sand in the narrow shadow of the dromedary's body, wrapped in my abaya against the heat outside me and the pain and thirst and dread within me. I cannot think any more. I cannot close my eyes. Every movement of the lids is like hot metal on the eyeballs. Thirst and heat, thirst and crushing silence, a dry silence that swathes you into its shroud of loneliness and despair, and makes the singing of blood in your ears and the camel's occasional sigh stand out, threateningly, as though these were the last sounds on earth and you too, the man and the beast, the last living beings, doomed beings on earth. High above us in the swimming heat, a vulture circles slowly, without ever stopping, a pinpoint against the hard paleness of the sky, free and above all horizons. My throat is swollen, constricted, and every breath moves 1,000 torturing needles at the base of my tongue. That big, big tongue which should not move but cannot stop moving in pain, backward, forward, like a rasp against the dry cavity of my mouth. All my insides are hot and intertwined in one unceasing grip of agony. For seconds the steel sky becomes black to my wide open eyes. My hand moves as if of its own, and strikes against the hard butt of the carbine slung on the saddle-bag, and the hand stands still, and with sudden clarity the mind sees the 5 good shells in the magazine, and the quick end that a pressure on the trigger could bring. Something in me whispers, "Move quickly, get the carbine before you are unable to move again." And then I feel my lips move and shape toneless words that come from some dark recesses of my mind. "We shall try you, most certainly try you." And the blurred words slowly assume shape and fall into pattern. A verse from the Quran. "We shall most certainly try you with fear and hunger, and with the lack of possessions and labor's fruits. But give the good tidings to those who remain steadfast, and when calamity befalls them say, Behold, to God we belong, and unto him do we return." Everything is hot and dark, but out of the hot darkness I sense a cooling breath of wind and hear it rustle slowly. Wind rustling, as if in trees, over water, and the water is the sluggish little stream between grassy banks, near the home of my childhood. I am lying on the bank, a little boy of 9 or 10 years, chewing a grass stalk and gazing at the white cows, which graze nearby with great, dreamy eyes and the innocence of contentment. In the distance peasant women work in the field. One of them wears a red handkerchief and a blue skirt with broad red stripes. Willow trees stand on the bank of the stream, and over its surface glides a white duck, making the water glitter in its wake. And the soft wind rustles over my face like an animal's snort. Oh yes, it is indeed an animal's snort. The big white cow with the brown spots has come quite close to me, and now nudges me, snorting, with its muzzle, and I feel the movement of its legs by my side. I open my eyes, and hear the snort of my dromedary, and feel the movement of its legs by my side. It has half raised itself on its hind legs with uplifted neck and head, its nostrils widened as if scenting a sudden, welcome smell in the noon air. It snorts again, and I sense the excitement rippling down its long neck toward the shoulder and the big, half-raised body. I have seen camels snuffle and snort like this when they scent water after long days of desert travel. But there is no water here. Or is there? I lift my head and follow with my eyes the direction towards which the camel has turned its head. It is the dune nearest us, a low summit against the steely bleakness of the sky, empty of movement or sound. But there is a sound. There is a faint sound like the vibration of an old harp, very delicate and brittle, high-pitched, the high-pitched, brittle sound of a Bedouin voice chanting on the march in rhythm with the camel's tread, just beyond the summit of the sand hill, quite near as distances go. But I know it in a fraction of an instant, far beyond my reach or the sound of my voice. There are people there, but I cannot reach them. I am too weak even to get up. I try to shout, but only a hoarse grunt comes from my throat. And then my hand strikes, as if of its own, against the hard butt of the carbine on the saddle, and with the eyes of my mind I see the 5 good shells in the magazine. With a supreme effort, I manage to unsling the weapon from the saddle peg. Drawing the bolt is like lifting a mountain, but finally it is done. I stand the carbine on its butt and fire a shot vertically into the air. The bullet winds into the emptiness with a pitifully thin sound. I draw the bolt again and fire again. And then listen. The harp-like singing has stopped. For a moment there is nothing but silence. Suddenly a man's head, and then his shoulders appear over the crest of the dune, and another man by his side. They look down for a while, then turn around and shout something to some invisible companions, and the man in front clambers over the crest and half runs, half slides down the slope towards me. There is commotion around me. 2, 3 men, what a crowd after all that loneliness, are trying to lift me up, their movements a most confusing pattern of arms and legs. I feel something burning cold, like ice and fire, on my lips, and see a bearded Bedouin face bent over me, his hand pressing a dirty moist rag against my mouth. The man's other hand is holding an open water skin. I make an instinctive move toward it, but the Bedouin gently pushes my hand back, dunks the rag into the water, and again presses a few drops onto my lips. I have to bite my teeth together to prevent the water from burning my throat, but the Bedouin pries my teeth apart and again drops some water into my mouth. It is not water, it is molten lead. Why are they doing this to me? I want to run away from the torture, but they hold me back, the devils. My skin is burning. My whole body is in flames. Do they want to kill me? Oh, if only I had the strength to get hold of my rifle to defend myself. But they do not even let me rise. They hold me down to the ground and pry my mouth open again and drip water into it. And I have to swallow it. And strangely enough, it does not burn as fiercely as a moment ago. And the wet rag on my head feels good. And when they pour water over my body, the touch of the wet clothes brings a shudder of delight. And then all goes black. I am falling, falling down a deep well. The speed of my falling makes the air rush past my ears. The rushing grows into a roar, a roaring blackness. Black, black. Section 5. Black, black, a soft blackness without sound, a good and friendly darkness that embraces you like a warm blanket, and makes you wish that you could always remain like this, so wonderfully tired and sleepy and lazy. And there is really no need for you to open your eyes or to move your arm, but you do move your arm and do open your eyes, only to see darkness above you, the woolen darkness of a Bedouin tent made of black goat hair, with a narrow opening in front that shows you a piece of starry night sky, and the soft curve of a dune shimmering under the starlight. And then the tent opening darkens and a man's figure stands in it, the outline of his flowing cloak sharply etched against the sky. And I hear Zad's voice exclaim, "He is awake! He is awake!" And his austere face comes quite close to my own, and his hand grips my shoulder. Another man enters the tent. I cannot clearly see him, but as soon as he speaks with a slow, solemn voice, I know he is a Shamar Bedouin. Again I feel a hot, consuming thirst and grip hard the bowl of milk which Zad holds out toward me. But there is no longer any pain when I gulp it down while Zad relates how this small group of Bedouins happened to camp near him at the time when the sandstorm broke loose, and how, when the strayed camel calmly returned by itself during the night, they became worried and went out all of them together to search for me, and how, after nearly 3 days, when they had almost given up hope, they heard my rifle shot from behind a dune. And now they have erected a tent over me, and I am ordered to lie in it tonight and tomorrow. Our Bedouin friends are in no hurry. Their water skins are full. They have even been able to give 3 bucketfuls to my dromedary, for they know that one day's journey toward the south will bring them and us to an oasis where there is a well. And in the meantime, the camels have fodder enough in the humped bushes that grow all around. After a while, Zad helps me out of the tent, spreads a blanket on the sand, and I lie down under the stars. A few hours later, I awaken to the clanking of Zad's coffee pots. The smell of fresh coffee is like a woman's embrace. "Zad!" I call out, and am pleasantly surprised that my voice, though still tired, has lost its croak. "Wilt thou give me some coffee?" "By God I will, O my uncle," answers Zad, following the old Arab custom of thus addressing a man to whom one wants to show respect, be he older or younger than the speaker. As it happens, I am a few years younger than Zad. "Thou shalt have as much coffee as thy heart desires." I drink my coffee and grin at Zad's happy countenance. Why, brother, do we expose ourselves to such things, instead of staying in our homes like sensible people? "Because," Zad grins back at me, "it is not for the like of thee and me to wait in our homes until the limbs become stiff and old age overtakes us. And besides, do not people die in their houses as well? Does not man always carry his destiny around his neck, wherever he may be?" The word Zad uses for destiny is qisma, that which is apportioned, better known to the West in its Turkish form, kismet. And while I sip another cup of coffee, it passes through my mind that this Arabic expression has another, deeper meaning as well, that in which one has a share. These words strike a faint, elusive chord in my memory. There was a grin that accompanied them. Whose grin? A grin behind a cloud of smoke, pungent smoke, like the smoke of hashish. Yes, it was the smoke of hashish, and the grin belonged to one of the strangest men I have ever met. And I met him after one of the strangest experiences of my life, while trying to escape from a danger that seemed, only seemed, to be imminent in its threat. I had been racing, without knowing it, into a danger far more real, far more imminent, than the one I was trying to elude, and both the unreal danger and the real one led to another escape. It all happened nearly 8 years ago, when I was traveling on horseback, accompanied by my Tatar servant Ibrahim, from Shiraz to Kirman in southern Iran, a desolate, thinly populated, roadless stretch near Neris Lake. Now in winter, it was a squelchy, muddy steep with no villages in the vicinity, hedged into the south by Kohe Gushnegan, the mountains of the hungry. Toward the north it dissolved into the swamps that bordered the lake, In the afternoon, as we circumvented an isolated hill, the lake came suddenly into view, a motionless green surface without breath or sound or life, for the water was so salty that no fish could live in it. Apart from a few crippled trees and desert shrubs, the salty soil near its shores did not allow any vegetation to grow. The ground was lightly covered with muddy snow, and over it, at a distance of about 200 yards from the shore, ran a thinly outlined path. The evening fell, and the caravanserai of Khanifat, our goal for the night, was nowhere in sight. But we had to reach it at any price. Far and wide there was no other settlement, and the nearness of the swamps made progress in darkness extremely hazardous. In fact, we had been warned in the morning not to venture there alone, for one false step might easily mean sudden death. Apart from that, our horses were very tired after a long day's march over oozy ground and had to be rested and fed. With the coming of the night, heavy rain set in. We rode, wet and morose and silent, relying on the instinct of the horses rather than on our useless eyes. Hours passed, and no caravanserai appeared. Perhaps we had passed it by in the darkness, and would now have to spend the night in the open under a downpour that was steadily mounting in strength. The hoofs of our horses splashed through water. Our sodden clothes clung heavily to our bodies. Black and opaque hung the night around us under its veils of streaming water. We were chilled to the bone, but the knowledge that the swamps were so close was even more chilling. Should the horses at any time miss the solid ground, then may God have mercy upon you. We had been warned in the morning. I rode ahead, with Ibrahim following perhaps 10 paces behind. Again and again the terrifying thought, had we left Khanifat behind us in the darkness? What an evil prospect to have to spend the night under the cold rain. But if we proceed further, what about the swamps? All of a sudden a soft, squishy sound from under my horse's hoofs. I felt the animal slide in the muck, draw up one leg frantically, slide again, and the thought pierced my mind. The swamp! I jerked the reins hard and dug my heels into the horse's flanks. It tossed its head high and started working its legs furiously. My skin broke out in cold perspiration. The night was so black that I could not even discern my own hands. But in the convulsive heaving of the horse's body, I sensed its desperate struggle against the embrace of the swamp. Almost without thinking, I grabbed the riding crop which ordinarily hung unused at my wrist and struck the horse's hind quarters with all my might, hoping thus to incite it to utmost effort. For if it stood still now, it would be sucked, and I with it, deeper and deeper into the mud. Unaccustomed to such ferocious beating, the poor beast, a Kashgai stallion of exceptional speed and power, reared on its hind legs, struck the ground with all fours again, strained gaspingly against the mud, jumped, slipped, heaved itself forward again, and slipped again. And all the time its hoofs beat desperately against the soft, oozy mire. Some mysterious object swept with a swish over my head. I raised my hand and received a hard, incomprehensible blow. What from? Time and thought tumbled over one another and became confused. Through the splashing of the rain and the panting of the horse, I could hear, for seconds that were like hours, the relentless sucking sound of the swamp. The end must be near. I loosened my feet from the stirrups, ready to jump from the saddle and try my luck alone. Perhaps I could save myself if I lay flat on the ground, when suddenly, unbelievably, the horse's hoofs struck against hard ground, once, twice, and with a sob of relief, I pulled the reins and brought the quivering animal to a standstill. We were saved. Only now did I remember my companion and called out, full of terror, Ibrahim! No answer. My heart went cold. Ibrahim! But there was only the black night around me and the falling rain. Had he been unable to save himself? With a hoarse voice I called out once again, Ibrahim! And then, almost beyond belief, a shout sounded faintly from a great distance. Here! I am here! Now it was my reason's turn to stand still. How had we become so widely separated? Ibrahim! Here! Here! And following the sound, leading my horse by the reins and dusting every inch of ground with my feet, I walked very slowly, very carefully toward the distant voice. And there was Ibrahim, sitting calmly in his saddle. What has happened to you, Ibrahim? Didn't you also blunder into the swamp? Swamp? No. I simply stood still when you suddenly, I don't know why, galloped away. Galloped away? The riddle was solved. The struggle against the swamp had been only a fruit of my imagination. My horse must have simply stepped into a muddy rut, and I, thinking that we were being drawn into the morass, had whipped it into a frenzied gallop. Cheated by the darkness, I had mistaken the animal's forward movement for a desperate struggle against the swamp, and had been racing blindly through the night, unaware of the many gnarled trees that dotted the plain. These trees, and not the swamp, had been the immediate real danger. The small twig that had struck my hand could as well have been a larger branch, which might have broken my skull and thus brought my journey to a decisive end, in an unmarked grave in southern Iran. I was furious with myself, doubly furious because now we had lost all orientation and could no longer find a trace of the path. Now we would never find the caravanserai. But once again I was mistaken. Ibrahim dismounted to feel the terrain with his hands, and so perhaps to rediscover the path. And while he was crawling thus on all fours, his head suddenly struck a wall, the dark wall of the caravanserai of Khanikhat. But for my imaginary blundering into the swamp, we would have gone on, missed the caravanserai, and truly lost ourselves in the swamps, which, as we subsequently learned, began less than 200 yards ahead. The caravanserai was one of the many decayed remnants of the epoch of Shah Abbas the Great. Mighty blocks of masonry with vaulted passageways, gaping doorways, and crumbling fireplaces. Here and there you could discern traces of old carving over the lintels and cracked majolica tiles. The few inhabitable rooms were littered with old straw and horse dung. When Ibrahim and I entered the main hall, we found the overseer of the caravanserai seated by an open fire on the bare ground. At his side was a barefooted man of diminutive size, draped in a tattered cloak. Both rose to their feet at our appearance, and the little stranger bowed solemnly with an exquisite, almost theatrical gesture, the right hand placed over the heart. His cloak was covered with innumerable multicolored patches. He was dirty, entirely unkempt, but his eyes were shining and his face serene. The overseer left the room to attend to our horses. I threw off my soaked tunic, while Ibrahim immediately set himself to making tea over the open fire. With the condescension of a great lord who forfeits none of his dignity by being courteous to his inferiors, the odd little man graciously accepted the cup of tea which Ibrahim held out toward him. Without any show of undue curiosity, as if opening a drawing-room conversation, he turned to me. You are English, Janabi Ali? No, I am a Namsawi, Austrian. Would it be improper to ask if it is business that brings you to these parts? I am a writer for newspapers, I replied. I am traveling through your country to describe it to the people of my own. They love to know how others live and what they think. He nodded with an approving smile and lapsed into silence. After a while, he drew a small clay water pipe and a bamboo rod from the folds of his cloak. He attached the rod to the clay vessel. Then he rubbed something that looked like tobacco between his palms and placed it carefully, as if it were more precious than gold in the bowl of the pipe, covering it with live coals. With a visible effort, he drew in the smoke through the bamboo rod, violently coughing and clearing his throat in the process. The water in the clay pipe bubbled and a biting odor began to fill the room. And then I recognized it. It was Indian hemp, hashish, and now I understood also the man's strange mannerisms. He was a hashashi, an addict. His eyes were not veiled like those of opium smokers. They shone with a kind of detached, impersonal intensity, staring into a distance that was immeasurably removed from the real world around them. I looked on in silence. When he finished his pipe at last, he asked me, "Will you not try it?" I refused with thanks. I had tried opium once or twice, without any particular enjoyment, but this hashish business seemed too strenuous and unappetizing even to try. The hashashi laughed soundlessly. His squinting eyes glided over me with a friendly irony. "I know what you are thinking, oh my respected friend. You are thinking that hashish is the work of the devil and are afraid of it. Nonsense. Hashish is a gift from God. Very good, especially for the mind. Look here, Hazrat. Let me explain it to you. Opium is bad. There can be no doubt about it, for it awakens in man a craving for unattainable things. It makes his dreams greedy, like those of an animal. But hashish silences all greed and makes one indifferent to all things of the world. That's it. It makes one contented. You could place a mount of gold before a hashashi, not just while he is smoking, but at any time, and he would not even stretch out his little finger for it. Opium makes people weak and cowardly, but hashish kills all fear and makes a man brave as a lion. If you were to ask a hashashi to dive into an icy stream in the middle of winter, he would simply dive into it and laugh, for he has learned that to be without greed is to be without fear, and that if man goes beyond fear, he goes beyond danger as well, knowing that whatever happens to him is but his share in all that is happening. And he laughed again, with that short, shaking, soundless laughter between mockery and benevolence. Then he stopped laughing and only grinned behind his cloud of smoke, his shining eyes fixed on an immovable distance. My share in all that is happening, I think to myself as I lay under the friendly Arabian stars. I, this bundle of flesh and bone of sensations and perceptions, have been placed within the orbit of being, and am within all that is happening. Danger is only an illusion. Never can it overcome me, for all that happens to me is part of the all-embracing stream of which I myself am a part. Could it be, perhaps, that danger and safety, death and joy, destiny and fulfillment are but different aspects of this tiny, majestic bundle that is I? What endless freedom, O God, hast Thou granted to man! I have to close my eyes, so sharp is the pain of happiness at this thought, and wings of freedom brush me silently from afar in the breath of the wind that passes over my face. Section 6. I feel strong enough to sit up now, and Zad brings me one of our camel saddles to lean upon. Make thyself comfortable, O my uncle. It gladdens my heart to see thee well after I had mourned thee for dead. Thou hast been a good friend to me, Zad. What would I have done without thee all these years if thou hadst not followed my call and come to me? I have never regretted these years with thee, O my uncle. I still remember the day when I got thy letter, more than 5 years ago, calling me to Mecca. The thought of seeing thee again was dear to me, especially as in the meantime thou hadst been blessed with the blessing of Islam. But just then I had married a Muntafik girl, a virgin, and her love pleased me exceedingly. Those Iraqi girls, they have narrow waists and hard breasts like this. And smiling with remembrance, he presses his forefinger against the hard pommel of the saddle on which I am leaning. And it is difficult to let their embraces go. So I told myself, I will go, but not just now. Let me wait for a few weeks. But the weeks passed, and the months, and although I soon divorced that woman, the daughter of a dog, she had been making eyes at her cousin. I could not make up my mind to forsake my job with the Iraqi Agail, and my friends, and the joys of Baghdad and Basra, and always told myself, not just now, after a little while. But one day I was riding away from our camp, where I had collected my monthly pay, and was thinking of spending the night in a friend's quarters, when suddenly thou camest to my mind, and I remembered what thou hadst told me in thy letter of thy dear Rafika's death. May God have mercy on her. And I thought of how lonely thou must be without her, and all at once I knew I had to go to thee. And there and then I pulled off the Iraqi star from my egal and threw it away. Then, without even going to my house to collect my clothes, I turned my dromedary's head towards the Nufud, toward Najd, and started out, stopping only at the next village to buy a water skin and some provisions, and rode on and on until I met thee at Mecca, 4 weeks later. And dost thou remember that, our first journey together into the interior of Arabia, southward to the palm orchards and wheat fields of Wadi Bishar, and thence into the sands of Rania, which had never before been trodden by a non-Arab? And how will I remember it, O my uncle? Thou wert so keen on seeing the empty quarter, where the jinns make the sands sing under the sun. And what about those Badu living on its rim, who had never yet seen glass in their lives and thought that the eyeglasses were made of frozen water? They were like jinns themselves, reading tracks in the sand as other people read a book, and reading from the skies and from the air the coming of a sandstorm hours before it came. And dost thou recall, O my uncle, that guide we hired at Rania, that devil of a Badawi, whom thou wantedst to shoot down when he was about to abandon us in the midst of the desert? How furious he was about the machine with which thou makest pictures. We both laugh at that adventure which lies so far behind us, but at the time we did not feel at all like laughing. We were about 6 or 7 days' journey south of Riyadh when that guide, a fanatical Bedouin from the Ikhwan settlement of Rain, fell into a paroxysm of rage when I explained to him what my camera was for. He wanted to leave us there and then because such heathenish picture-making endangered his soul. I would not have minded getting rid of him, had it not been that we were just then in a region with which neither Zad nor I was familiar and where, left to ourselves, we would certainly have lost our way. At first I tried to reason with our devil of a Bedouin, but to no avail. He remained adamant and turned back his camel toward Rania. I made it clear to him that it would cost him his life to leave us to almost certain death from thirst, when in spite of this warning he set his dromedary in motion. I aimed my rifle at him and threatened to fire, with every intention of doing so, and this at last seemed to outweigh our friend's concern about his soul. After some grumbling, he agreed to lead us to the next large settlement, about 3 days ahead, where we could place our dispute before the Qadi for decision. Zed and I disarmed him and took turns standing guard during the night to prevent him from slipping away. The Qadi at Gowaiya, to whom we appealed a few days later, at first gave judgment in favor of our guide, for he said, "It is shameful to make pictures of living beings," basing it on a wrong interpretation of saying of the Prophet, for despite the belief so prevalent among many Muslims to this day that the depicting of living beings is forbidden, Islamic law contains no injunction to this effect. Thereupon I showed the Qadi the open letter from the king to all emirs of the land and everyone who may read this, and the Qadi's face grew longer and longer as he read. Muhammad Asad is our guest and friend and dear unto us, and everyone who shows him friendliness shows it to us, and everyone who is hostile to him will be deemed hostile to us. Ibn Saud's words and seal had a magic effect on the severe Qadi, and he ultimately decided that under certain circumstances it might be permissible to make pictures. Nevertheless, we let our guide go and hired another to lead us to Riyadh. And dost thou remember those days in Riyadh, O my uncle, when we were guests of the king and thou wert so unhappy to see the old stables of the palace filled with shiny new motor cars, and the king's graciousness towards thee? And dost thou remember, Zad, how he sent us out to explore the secrets behind the Bedouin rebellion, and how we journeyed through many nights and stole into Kuwait, and at last found out the truth about the cases of glittering new rials and rifles that were coming to the rebels from across the sea? And that other mission, O my uncle, when Sayyid Ahmed, may God lengthen his life, sent thee to Cyrenaica, and how we secretly crossed the sea to Egypt in a dhow, and how we made our way into the Jabal Akhtar, eluding the vigilance of those Italians, may God's curse be upon them, and joined the Mujahideen under Umar al-Mukhtar. Those were exciting days. And so we continued to remind each other of the many days, the innumerable days we have been together, and our "Dost thou remember? Dost thou remember?" carries us far into the night, until the campfire flickers lower and lower, and only a few pieces of wood remain glowing, and Zad's face gradually recedes into the shadows, and itself becomes like a memory to my heavy eyes. In the starlit silence of the desert, with a tender, lukewarm wind rippling the sands, the images of past and present intertwine, separate again, and call to one another with wondrous sounds of evocation, backward through the years, back to the beginning of my Arabian years, to my first pilgrimage to Mecca, and the darkness that overshadowed those early days, to the death of the woman whom I loved as I have loved no woman since, and who now lies buried under the soil of Mecca, under a simple stone without inscription that marks the end of her road, and the beginning of a new one for me, an end and a beginning, a call and an echo, strangely intertwined in the rocky valley of Mecca. Zed, is there some coffee left? At thy command, O my uncle, answers Zed. He rises without haste, the tall, narrow brass coffee pot in his left hand, and two minute, handleless cups clinking in his right, one for me and one for himself, pours a little coffee into the first cup and hands it to me. From under the shadow of the red and white checked kufiya, His eyes regard me with solemn intentness, as if this were a much more serious matter than a mere cup of coffee. These eyes, deep-set and long-lashed, austere and sad in repose, but ever ready to flash in a sudden gaiety, speak of 100 generations of life in steeps and freedom, the eyes of a man whose ancestors have never been exploited and have never exploited others. But the most beautiful in him are his movements, serene, aware of their own rhythm, never hurried and never hesitant, a precision and economy that reminds you of the interplay of instruments in a well-ordered symphony orchestra. You see such movements often among Bedouins. The sparseness of the desert is reflected in them. For, apart from the few towns and villages, life in Arabia has been so little molded by human hands that nature in her austerity has forced man to avoid all diffusion in behavior, and to reduce all being dictated by his will or by outward necessity to a few very definite, basic forms, which have remained the same for countless generations, and have in time acquired the smooth sharpness of crystals. And this inherited simplicity of action is now apparent in the true Arab's gestures, as well in his attitude toward life. Tell me, Zad, where are we going tomorrow? Zad looks at me with a smile. Why, oh my uncle? Toward Taima, of course. No, brother, I wanted to go to Taima, but now I do not want it any more. We are going to Mecca. End of chapter 1.